Wyoming Territory, December 1883. The wind came down hard off the Bighorn Mountains, dragging needles of snow across the land like it meant to skin it bare. Quinton O'Dell pulled his horse up short at the edge of a frozen stream, his breath turning white in the cold. That was when he saw her. She was huddled beneath a cottonwood, her arms wrapped tight around two small children, all of them shaking from cold. Her dress was torn at the hem, boots soaked through, and her hair, long and dark, stuck to her cheeks like wet ribbon. The children, one no older than 5, the other maybe 3, clung to her sides, eyes wide and hollow. Quinton dismounted fast. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. "Are you hurt?" She looked up, blinking like she was trying to see if he was real. "No," she whispered. "Just cold." "We've been walking since morning." He crouched beside her, unbuckling his saddle blanket and wrapping it around the kids. "You cannot stay out here. You will freeze." The little boy buried his face into his mother's chest. The girl didn't speak at all. The woman's voice cracked as she tried to stand. "I did not know where else to go." "Come on," Quinton said, looping his arm around her shoulders. "My camp is not far. Fire's still going." She hesitated only a second. Then she nodded, and together they moved slowly, Quinton carrying the boy and leading the horse with his free hand while the woman walked beside him, holding her daughter close. They crossed the flat, frozen ground to a small rise where his campfire burned, half hidden between 2 boulders. He lifted the boy down gently and helped the woman ease herself to the ground. She pulled the children close again as Quinton threw more wood on the fire. "I have coffee," he said, "and some beans. Not much, but it is hot." She nodded, her lips trembling. "Thank you." He handed her his tin cup, steam rising from it, and she took it with both hands. The boy reached for the heat, his small fingers curling around hers. "I am Quinton O'Dell," he said, squatting across from her. "You have a name," she nodded. "Clara Lark." He glanced at the children. "Yours?" She looked down at them, holding them tighter. "Yes, this is Kellen, and that's Clara." Her voice cracked again. "We were with a wagon train, headed to Idaho. My husband, he fell ill outside Casper. We buried him 2 weeks ago." Quinton's jaw tightened. "You were alone after that," Clara nodded. "Why did the wagon master let you go off alone?" "They were behind on supplies, said they could not wait for us. We tried to catch another group, but," her shoulders sagged, "we got turned around in the snow." Quinton stared into the fire. "Damn them," he muttered. Clara said nothing. He looked back at her, at the way her fingers trembled even near the flames. And the children, thin, pale, eyes too quiet for their age. "You will stay here tonight," he said. Clara met his eyes. "You do not have to. I know what I have to do," he said. "And I am doing it." He stood, pulled a second blanket from his saddle roll and draped it over her shoulders. "Get warm. I will keep watch." That night the wind howled like wolves across the ridge, but the campfire stayed strong. Quinton sat nearby, rifle across his lap, eyes on the dark. Clara had curled around the children, their small bodies pressed tight against her. She did not sleep. He heard her whispering to them, quiet, broken things. Promises, maybe. Apologies. He did not pry. When her voice went silent, she looked up at him. "Why are you out here alone?" he shrugged. "Worked cattle most of my life, got tired of bosses and brands, figured I'd go where no one told me what to do." "That sounds lonely," she said. He met her eyes. "Sometimes." She nodded. "I am sorry I brought trouble to your fire." "You did not." He meant it. By morning, the snow had stopped. The fire was down to red coals, and the children were finally sleeping sound. Quinton stood up, stretched the stiffness from his back, and went to check his traps down near the creek. When he came back, Clara was awake, watching him. "You caught something." "Rabbit," he said, holding it up. "Enough for soup." She offered a tired smile. "I had not smelled real food in days." Quinton cleaned the rabbit, started the pot. As it simmered, Clara stood and stepped to the edge of the rocks, wrapping the blanket tighter around her. The morning sun lit the edge of her face, and for the first time she looked like a woman again, not just a mother lost in the cold. "Where will you go now?" he asked. She turned, her eyes soft. "I do not know any family, not anymore." He stirred the pot, then looked at her. "You could ride with me. I am headed west, Montana maybe, plenty of land, good hunting." She blinked. "You mean all of us?" He nodded once. Clara looked down at her sleeping children. "I cannot offer much. You already did," he said. Her eyes met his again, and this time something passed between them. Not just gratitude, not just fear, something steadier, something warmer than the fire. That night they sat close around the fire again, the children fed and asleep. Clara shifted beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Quinton looked into the flames. "Because I was raised to believe a man should do right when he sees wrong." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You are not like most men." He glanced at her. "You do not know me." "I know enough," she said softly. "You found me beside a frozen stream. You saved my children. You shared your fire without asking anything in return." Quinton looked at her, the pale firelight flickering across her face. "You trusted me." "I had to." "No," he said. "You chose to." Clara looked down, then up again. Her eyes were wet but steady. "Maybe I did." He reached out and took her hand, rough palm against her cold fingers. She did not pull away. And for the first time since he left the ranches, since he gave up on belonging anywhere, Quinton felt something settle in his chest, something like purpose, something like home. The third morning dawned gray and brittle. The fire had burned low again, but the sky promised no more snow, just the sharp, dry cold that settled deep into the lungs. Quinton rose first, careful not to stir the children huddled between Clara's arms. He moved stiffly, his limbs slow from sleeping halfway upright against a rock. The saddle blanket he'd given up was still wrapped tight around the girl. He stepped away from camp, boots crunching over the crusted snow, and took a long look west. The land stretched pale and empty, rimmed by distant cottonwoods and broken fence posts jutting out from some long abandoned line. It wouldn't take much to follow the river north, then cut through the basin. There were old trappers' paths threaded through the hills near there. He'd used them once, years back, chasing elk. Clara's voice reached him before he turned. "Do you think we'll reach the basin before the next snow?" He looked over his shoulder. She was standing now, arms folded tight against the cold, her hair in a loose braid that hadn't been there yesterday. She looked steadier, though her eyes still held the dull edge of exhaustion. "If we head out by midday, we can make the old hunter's lean-to by nightfall," he said. "It's weathered, but it'll keep the wind off." She walked closer, careful not to wake the children. "You've been out here a long time," he nodded. "Left the last cattle outfit 2 winters ago." "Why?" He looked past her toward the stand of bare trees. "Sometimes a man gets tired of being ordered by the kind of folks who never dirtied their hands." Clara's gaze followed his. "So you came out here alone?" "Figured I'd rather answer to the land than to men who never looked it in the eye." She was quiet a moment, then said, "Did you ever want a family?" Quinton rubbed a hand down his jaw. "I thought about it, once." "What stopped you?" He looked back at her. "Never found someone I could trust with the truth of me." Clara tilted her head. "What truth is that?" "That I've seen things I can't set down, that I carry them, even on quiet days." She didn't shy from that. "I know what that's like." "I figured you might." She stepped closer, pulled her shawl tighter. "I keep thinking about the day we left Casper. I should have stayed, found a job, taken in washing maybe. Instead, I held on to a plan already gone to pieces. Plans don't matter much when the ground shifts under you. But the children," she paused, then looked up. I was trying to hold us together with thread. He met her eyes. You still are. But now there's two hands sewing. A gust cut through the trees and she looked down, blinking fast. I don't know what we're heading toward. Neither do I, he said, but I know how to keep moving. She nodded, then reached out and touched his sleeve. I want to learn that. He didn't speak, just placed his hand gently over hers. Behind them, Kellen stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. Clara turned and went to him, kneeling beside her children. Quinton watched her brush snowflakes from the boy's hair, her fingers careful but sure. By late morning, they had packed what little they had. Clara wrapped Kiera against her chest with a strip of cloth she'd torn from the bottom of her skirt, while Kellen held Quinton's hand steady as they walked. The horse moved slow, carrying their supplies and little else. They didn't speak much on the trail. The wind had quieted, and the only sound was the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional call of a crow overhead. Once, near a frozen bend in the river, Clara pointed out a set of rabbit tracks. Quinton nodded and veered off to check a snare he'd set the night before. It was empty, but he didn't say so. As the sun dipped behind the hills, they reached the shelter. A lean-to of timber and stone, half covered by snowdrift, but the rock wall held firm. Quinton cleared the entrance, then lit a fresh fire from dried pine tucked beneath the chimney lip. Inside, Clara laid the children down on the bed of needles and canvas. Quinton handed her his coat, and she didn't argue. When he returned from tethering the horse, she was sitting by the fire, her hands open to the warmth. "I've been thinking," she said, not looking at him. He sat beside her, close enough to feel the heat from her shoulder. "About what?" "My husband's people lived in Georgia. He never spoke much about them, never wrote. I think I kept believing someone would come for us, that someone would care." "You waited for a letter," she nodded. He looked into the flames. "Sometimes the only people who care are the ones you meet after everything's gone wrong." Clara turned her face toward his. "I believe that now." He didn't move. Neither did she. They stayed that way a long while, the firelight flickering across the rough stones and the children sleeping sound nearby. When she finally leaned her head against his shoulder, he rested his cheek on her hair without a word. And in the quiet, with the wind sealed out and the darkness held at bay, it felt like the world had paused just long enough to give them a beginning. By the fifth day, the wind had turned from sharp to still, and the snow crusted heavy underfoot. They made slower time than Quinton liked, but Clara's pace never faltered, even with Kiera strapped close to her chest and Kellen tucked in ahead of her. The boy had taken to riding the horse in stretches, quiet and watchful, his hands knotted in the mane like he was afraid to let go. They followed the river's bend north, keeping low where the land offered cover. The sky was pale with high clouds, the kind that promised more cold but not yet snow. Quinton carried the weight of their supplies on his back now, the horse half lame from an old stone bruise that had worsened in the freeze. He kept his eye on the animal's gait, already thinking of the next crossing. "Do you know how much farther?" Clara asked, adjusting Kiera's blanket with one hand as she walked. "There's a fur trader's shack a day and a half ahead," he said. "Old place. Last I saw, it still had a roof." She looked over at him. "And after that? There's a woman in the basin grows beans and corn through the thaw, widowed some years back. She'll trade for meat or repairs if we bring something worth her time." Clara nodded, her breath sharp in the cold. "I can sew." Quinton gave a short glance. "You can do more than that." She didn't answer, but her mouth pressed into a line that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't sorrow either. They stopped at midday beneath a wind-stripped cedar, where Quinton built a fire from bark and dry needles. He handed Clara a strip of dried venison and crouched to check the horse's hoof again. The animal flinched as he pressed along the frog. "He won't take much more of this," he muttered. Clara shifted Kiera to her hip. "What happens if he can't walk?" Quinton straightened. "We carry what we can. Leave the rest." She looked toward the horizon. "We'll need a place to stay soon." "I know." "You said there's land near the basin, flat and fertile," he said, "but unclaimed. Nearest post is 3 days past it. If we could build something—" She stopped herself, then looked at him. "Would you stay?" Quinton tossed a few more twigs on the fire. "I would if it meant something." She knelt beside the heat, settling Kiera into her lap. "It would mean something, to me." He didn't speak right away. He watched the way the girl's small hand curled against her mother's chest, the way Clara's fingers moved gently through her hair. He'd seen women mother children before, but this was different. There was no softness born of ease in Clara. Everything she did was deliberate, as though each motion cost her something and she gave it anyway. "I never thought about a place of my own," he said. "Maybe it's time you did." She met his eyes as she said it, and what passed between them wasn't hope but certainty. The kind that settled quiet and deep, like a fence post driven into firm ground. Later, as they walked again, Kellen tugged at Quinton's coat. "Are we gonna see cows?" "Maybe," Quinton said. "If we find pasture, we might see some wild ones or someone's herd." The boy nodded solemnly. "I can help watch 'em." Quinton glanced down. "You ever watched cows before?" "No, but I'm good at watching stuff." Quinton ruffled his hair once, then dropped his hand. "I believe that." As dusk fell, they reached a narrow ravine where the river dipped low and the rocks held back the wind. It was a good enough place to make camp. Quinton set his bedroll near the fire and helped Clara arrange the children beneath the canvas, tucking Kellen close to his sister. Clara stayed by the flames as the sky darkened, pulling her shawl tighter. Her face looked different in the half-light, less pinched, more certain. The lines at the corners of her mouth had eased since that first night. "I've been thinking about the land you mentioned," she said. "If we built something, started small, it doesn't have to be much, just sound walls, a stove. A place for the children to sleep." Quinton nodded slowly. "I've built with my hands before, barns, lean toss, fences." She turned toward him. "Could you build a home?" He didn't answer right away. The fire cracked between them, throwing sparks into the cold. Then he said, "If I had someone to build it with." Clara reached across the space between them, her fingers brushing his. Not hesitant, not unsure, just steady. "You do," she said. He turned his hand over, laced his fingers with hers. The cold hung thick around them, but the fire burned clean, and for the first time in years, something in Quinton unknotted. Not all at once, but enough. He looked at her, face lit by the low flame, and saw not the woman he'd found huddled by the stream, but the one who'd kept walking, who'd carried her children through the worst stretch of winter with nothing but her own will. "I've never had a place," he said. "You do now," she told him. And he believed her. The next day broke with a brittle stillness, the kind that made trees creak and breath seem louder than it should. They broke camp before the light deepened, with Clara adjusting Kiera against her hip and Kellen walking close to Quinton, his small boots sinking into snow that had crusted soft overnight. The river veered westward, and they followed the slope upward, rising through a shallow pass where the rocks held pockets of ice tucked like secrets. Quinton watched the boy out of the corner of his eye. Kellen had stopped asking questions and begun watching the trail with quiet attention. He didn't speak unless spoken to, but when Quinton pointed toward a dip in the ridgeline, Kellen nodded as if he'd already seen it. "You see things most folks miss," Quinton said, voice low. Kellen's face stayed serious. "Mama says it's from being quiet so long." Clara, a few steps behind them, glanced up at that. She didn't speak, but the way her eyes settled on the boy said more than words. A stand of stunted fir trees marked the turn. Quinton slowed the horse and laid a hand on its neck. The animal's limp had worsened, and he didn't like the way it stood with its weight shifted too long on one side. "There's a shallow pond up ahead," he said. "If the ice isn't too thick, we can water him and rest." Clara nodded. We could use the pause. The sun had climbed higher by the time they reached the basin of the hill. The pond lay beneath a fan of willow limbs, half frozen, the surface thin enough to crack with a boot heel. Quinton broke through the edge with a branch and led the horse to drink. Clara knelt beside the water, untying the wrap from her waist. Kiera stirred, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Clara dipped a cloth into the ice water and brushed it gently across the child's forehead. "She runs warmer than usual," Clara said, her brow tight. Quinton crouched beside her. "Could be teeth coming in. She's too young for that." He looked at the girl's face. Her eyes were open but unfocused. "I had a fever like that once back east," Clara said. "Didn't break for days. My mother soaked linens in vinegar and laid them across my chest." He stood, pulled his pack open, and rifled through what little they had. "I've got some dried sage and willow bark. We can boil it. Might help take the fever down." As he set the small pot beside the fire he'd started, Clara wrapped Kiera tighter against her, her lips pressed to the girl's temple. The stillness in her face made something settle heavy in Quinton's chest. "You've done this before," she said after a moment, voice steady. "Some," he answered. "Not with babies, but I've seen men burn up from fever and come through." Clara looked over at him. "You don't talk about your people." He stirred the pot. "Not much to tell. Someone raised you." He didn't answer right away. "Then, my uncle, after my parents died. He shoed horses and drank more than he should have, taught me how to swing a hammer and keep my back straight. That's about the shape of it." She didn't press further, but her eyes stayed on him. When the tea was ready, Clara coaxed a few drops into Kiera's mouth. The baby fussed, turned her face, then settled. They stayed camped there through the afternoon. Kellen gathered sticks without being asked, piling them neatly near the fire. Quinton took the horse's saddle off and rubbed its legs with snow, careful and slow. Clara sat cross-legged with Kiera in her lap, humming a tune too soft to recognize. Her voice was thin but carried something old in it, something that reached past grief and made the silence feel less like absence. As dusk came on, Kellen crawled into her lap beside his sister. Clara wrapped her arms around both children, and when she lifted her face toward Quinton, there was no plea in it, only quiet readiness. "I want to stay close to the river," she said. "If the land near the basin is clear, I could plant by spring. I've sown seed before, helped dig irrigation ditches. My father kept a small plot behind our house. You remember how?" "I remember everything that mattered," he nodded. "We'll reach the trader's shack tomorrow. If it's holding steady, we'll rest there a few days. If she's still warm, we can keep her wrapped and ride the rest on foot." Clara looked down at Kiera, her fingers brushing lightly over the girl's crown. "I've carried her since before the storm. I'll carry her longer if I have to." Quinton settled on the other side of the fire, arms crossed over his knees. "You will, but not alone." She didn't answer, just met his eyes. The stars came out slow one by one until the sky was scattered with them. The cold deepened, but no wind followed. The fire burned steady. Quinton stayed awake long after the children slept, listening to the rhythm of Clara's breathing and the faint crackle of the fire. He didn't need to look to know her eyes were still open. "Are you afraid?" she asked, voice barely above the quiet. "No." "Why not?" He shifted, the flames casting long shadows behind him. "Because we're already past the worst stretch, and because I've never seen anyone hold their ground the way you do." She was silent for a long moment. Then, "I don't feel strong." "You don't have to feel it," he said. "You just have to be it." When she reached across the space between them, her fingers found his, cold but sure. They didn't speak again, but when her head came to rest lightly against his shoulder, he turned toward her just enough to let her stay. The fire burned low, but neither of them moved. By morning, the girl's fever had broken. The trader's shack stood low in the cottonwood flats, its boards weathered silver and the door hanging slightly off its hinges. A tangle of old harnesses and rusted traps hung along one wall, long since abandoned. Quinton tested the roofline with a push of his shoulder. It held. Clara stepped inside first, carrying Clara bundled against her chest. "It's tight," she said, glancing around the single room. "But it'll do." Kellen moved behind her, dragging a branch he'd found along the trail, proud of the weight of it. "We can burn this," he offered. "It's dry." Quinton took it from him, nodding. "Good eye." They didn't speak much as they settled in. Clara laid Clara down on a folded blanket near the hearth, and Quinton set to building a fire with the last of the pitchwood he'd saved. The chimney drew smoke slow but true. Kellen pressed his palms near the warmth and looked up at his mother, waiting. She knelt beside him, brushing a bit of trail dust from his cheek. "You've done well," she murmured. "You're helping." Outside, the wind pulled through the brush in long, low strokes. Quinton stepped out to check the traps he'd set before dusk. He returned carrying 2 rabbits and a pine hen, feathers still clinging to its breast. "That'll make stew," Clara said, already rolling up her sleeves while she plucked and cleaned. Quinton mended a corner of the roof with a square of canvas and a rusted nail he'd found near the door. The rhythm of their work was quiet but not heavy, the kind that came when 2 people moved toward something shared. That night, with the soup simmering low and the children asleep, Clara leaned back against the wall, her eyes on the fire. "I used to think I'd always be in someone else's house," she said. "My father's, then my husband's. I never imagined anything of my own." Quinton reached for the tin pot, poured her a cup. "You thought that was the only way." "I didn't think I had a say," she said, voice steady. "But now I watch Kellen sleep, and I want him to grow up knowing he's allowed to make things, not just follow them." Quinton looked over at her. "You've already given him that." She took the tin from his hand, fingers brushing his. "Only because someone stopped and saw us when they didn't have to." "I didn't stop out of charity," he said. "I stopped because I couldn't walk past you." Clara turned toward him, her face unreadable in the low light. "You never asked me to be grateful." "I didn't want that," he said. "I wanted to be near you." The silence stretched between them, not awkward but full. She reached across the space, her hand finding his knee. "I've never known what it felt like to be chosen by someone who saw me clear." He folded his fingers around hers. "You were never hidden." She smiled, slow and soft, and leaned forward until her forehead touched his. "I want us to stay here, build something real together." "We will," he said, voice low. "We'll fence the land, we'll plant, I'll dig the well. You'll line the shelves. I'll teach the children their letters, I'll build them beds." Clara drew back just enough to meet his eyes. "Do you want this, a life with me?" Quinton didn't hesitate. "More than anything I've ever wanted." She kissed him then, not shy, not rushed, just sure. The kind of kiss that came when the hard part had passed and something good had finally begun. They slept curled together that night, Kiara's soft breaths beside them, Kellen tucked close beneath the quilt. In the weeks that followed, the land thawed slowly. They built a door for the shack, patched the roof again, and dug a garden bed near the south side where the sun hit longest. Quinton trapped enough to trade with the widow in the basin, bringing back seed and a small goat Clara bartered for with a stitched shawl she'd made from scraps. Kellen helped haul stones for the root cellar. Quinton gave him a small hammer and let him tap in nails. Clara taught him to count in rows of beans, her voice patient, her hands steady. One morning, As dew clung to the grass and the goat bleated from the lean-to, Clara came out to where Quinton was splitting wood and set her hand on his arm. "I haven't felt afraid in days," she said. He looked up and smiled. "That's how you know it's home." They married beneath a cottonwood in the clearing behind the cabin. No preacher, no papers. Just promises spoken with the children watching, and a ring Quinton carved from antler and slipped over her finger. That night, Clara stood beneath the stars, Kiera asleep in her arms, and looked out over the land they'd claimed with nothing but grit and love. Quinton came up behind her, wrapped his arm around her waist. "There's nothing I'd change," he said. "Me neither." He leaned down, pressed his lips to her hair. "You ready for the next season? With you," she said, her voice full of quiet joy. "Always." Years passed, more than a few. The cabin grew with them, stretched to hold a second room, then a third. They planted rows so long Kellen once lost count and called it a forest. Kiera ran barefoot through the fields, her laughter echoing across the basin. They never left. Not once, and they never needed to.